Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Shane Coleman from News Talk. You're all very welcome here to this webinar. Great to welcome delegates from all across higher education, government and enterprise. By the way, we have closed captioning available today, and each delegate can alter the size of those captions by clicking on the CC button just there at the bottom of your screen. We have a brilliant panel for you today to discuss the various issues. I'll get to introduce that panel in a couple of moments. Our panelists can turn off their video and mute themselves now. They can rejoin us in a few moments. But I suppose just to kick things off, we're going to ask for some opening comments now from Professor Mark Rogers, Acting President of UCD and Chair of the IUA. Over to you, Mark, to kick things off.
Thanks very much, Shane. We're all very welcome. As Chair of the IUA, you're all very welcome to this webinar, Fake News and Disinformation, What Can Universities Do? The final Future of Ireland event of the year. Fake news is not a new phenomenon. We can think of examples dating back 100 years ago when, for example, during the War of Independence, the British media published a government photograph of a supposed ambush of troops in Tralee, County Kerry, which was, in fact, a set of bodies laid out on a road in Dalkey, County Dublin. The image was designed to shock and horrify readers in Britain, revealing what they called the grim reality of the struggle in Ireland. On that occasion, it was the Irish Independent who exposed the truth. If we fast forward to the digital age and the rise of populist politics, when interest groups, be they political or motivated by a cause or personal interest, can reach and influence massive audiences through social media platforms populated by citizen journalists and anonymous trolls. We can cite the outrageous claims of President Bolsonaro in Brazil, Prime Minister Orban in Hungary, former President Trump in the United States as examples of fake news. But closer to home, we experienced vaccine deniers who mobilized protests during the COVID pandemic and generated genuine fear amongst people whose own health and lives were put at risk. In today's world, universities, the storehouse of evidence-based research and academic freedom, and objective media, the channels of balanced and investigative journalism, play a crucial role in providing spaces and places for critical thinking and the communication of the truth. Today's webinar is relevant to all of us, and the panel of speakers, drawn from journalism, academia, and politics, are well placed to address the challenges posed by fake news. I believe that in addition to educating our own students to analyze and think critically about the news and information that surrounds them, our universities must actively contribute to knowledge creation and public awareness. The topic of fake news raises interesting questions about balancing the rights of free speech, of academic freedom, and of personal opinion with the importance of ensuring accurate and trustworthy sources of news and information. On our panel, we're joined by three leading researchers in the area: Professor Declan Devane, Professor of Health Research and Methodology, University of Galway; Dr. Christy Park, Institute of Future Media, Democracy and Society at Dublin City University; and Oluwafunmi Leo Jin Ado, PhD student at University of Limerick. It's also our pleasure to be joined by journalist John Williams, former head of RTE News and Current Affairs. And in his keynote, John will give us his view on the challenges of fake news for his profession and for society generally. And I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome MEP Billy Kelleher, who will join the panel a little later to discuss how fake news and disinformation is being tackled at a European level and how it is negatively impacting politics today. I hope you'll find the discussion today enlightening and interesting. The Future of Ireland series will continue in 2023, and the IUA team is working on a schedule of events that will enable debate on issues of importance to the sector and to society. Thank you.
Okay, thank you indeed, Mark. Now, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today, John Williams. During an esteemed 30-year career in journalism, John has covered some of the biggest stories of our time, most recently as Managing Director of News and Current Affairs for RTE. He led the renewal of RTE News, transforming the broadcaster into a digital-first news organisation, taking the news division to market leadership in every time slot on every platform, and reinforcing its position as Ireland's most trusted news provider, alongside News Talk, of course, I should add. As the BBC's UK news editor, he led the coverage of the 7/7 public transport bombings in 2005. He was also BBC's foreign editor and travelled many times to Afghanistan, overseeing the reporting of the British and American war with the Taliban. He was also with the US, the very well-regarded US network ABC, leading its reporting of the Syrian refugee crisis before joining RTE. In September, he returned home to London. He's currently writing a book, which I'm really looking forward to reading, entitled Boris, Brexit and the Border, due for publication next year, as long as things in British politics settle down for a little while. I think that probably may happen. Over to you, and we're delighted you could join us, John Williams.
Thanks very much, Shane, and thank you, Mark. It's great to be with you. There could scarcely be a more important time for us to be talking about this issue. Fake news is not something you disagree with, whatever Donald Trump might have you believe. Disinformation is false information. Let's call a spade, lies deliberately spread to influence public opinion or to obscure the truth. And it matters. Yesterday, more than half the Republican candidates running for statewide and federal office in the US midterm elections had raised unfounded doubts about the validity or integrity of the 2020 election results. According to research by CBS News, all but 2 of the states, Rhode Island and North Dakota, had an election denier on the ballot. 308 of 597 Republican candidates up for election. 20 of the 37 Republicans running for governor, 20 of 36 candidates for the US Senate, and 238 of the 436 men and women seeking election to the House of Representatives. Now, the much vaunted Republican wave didn't emerge overnight, but at least some of them triumphed, despite or maybe precisely because of the doubts that they sowed about the integrity of America's electoral process. And when an assailant broke into the home of the outgoing House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and attacked her husband with a hammer, some of them amplified false claims that mocked the victim and gave credence to baseless and homophobic claims that alleged a personal relationship between Paul Pelosi and his attacker. Among those to do so were prominent Republicans, conservative pundits, and Twitter's new owner, Elon Musk. Now, days before the midterms, of course, the self-styled chief twit chose to axe many of those Twitter used to combat disinformation on its platform and to offer those who peddle it legitimacy via its verification blue tick for us just $8 a month. Among those to lose their jobs were members of the curation team responsible for creating guides to authoritative information, often surfaced alongside topics with a high risk of disinformation, and the ethics, transparency, and accountability team, which opened up Twitter's algorithm to external review, the very people who studied the amplification of disinformation and other content. Now, some of the individuals, of course, were based in Dublin, and our thoughts are with them and their colleagues as they seek other roles. And fake news is nothing new. 300 years ago, that great product of an Irish university, Jonathan Swift, warned that falsehood flies and the truth limps after it. And that was before social media. But 3 centuries later, as Mark was saying, COVID showed us how the truth came under attack like never before. The World Health Organization said it didn't just fight a pandemic, but an infodemic of fake news that spreads more easily and faster than any virus and is just as dangerous. Indeed, researchers at Massachusetts Institute for Technology found that information on social media spread 6 times faster than the truth. And during the pandemic, harmful health advice and wild conspiracy theories posted online helped drive polarization, deception, and fear. Now, I've spent much of the past decade working with the Committee to Protect Journalists, a New York-based NGO that does what it says on the tin, fights to protect journalists and defend press freedom. And a decade ago, when I was the foreign editor of the BBC and then ABC, the risk to journalists and journalism came from places like Afghanistan and Iraq. But today, it's just as likely to be round the corner as on the other side of the globe. As we've heard, in Ireland, so-called anti-mask campaigners claimed COVID was a hoax. Protesters draped a banner over the N11 outside RTE, calling it fake news headquarters. As managing director of News and Current Affairs, I was accused of being part of a giant conspiracy. And my colleagues and journalists at other news organizations were trolled online, some verbally and physically attacked, simply for reporting facts. Last year, the US-based think tank, the Brookings Institution, found that the countries most targeted by foreign actors, at least among takedowns publicly announced by Facebook and Twitter, were the United States and the United Kingdom. Now, that said, we don't know what operations the social media companies failed to discover or chose not to publicize. And it may also be that takedowns are more common in places where both platforms and researchers disproportionately investigate. So how do we fight back? The answer might lie with 2022's answer to the 3 Rs: research, regulation, and rigorous fact-based journalism. It's vital that there is an alternative to the lies, but simply shouting the truth isn't enough. Audiences need to see verified fact-based journalism, and that's where initiatives like Reporters Without Borders Journalism Trust Initiative come in. Disinformation sets out to undermine trust in truth. And so we need to do the opposite. We need to increase transparency and open journalism up to scrutiny to show, quite simply, that we've nothing to hide. 18 months ago, RTE News became the first Irish news organisation to sign up to the JTI, the European Standard for Trusted Journalism. Think of it a bit like the Board Beer Quality Mark. Just as the food you buy, it has been produced and processed in Ireland to an independently audited and guaranteed standard, so the JTI signifies journalists independently audited against a series of different measures and found to meet the required European standard for trusted journalism. For RTE, it meant publishing a transparency report detailing everything from the ownership of the Irish people to committing to publishing upheld complaints with equal prominence as any offending item. And it was all independently audited by Deloitte. That brings us to the second R, and I'm delighted that Billy has joined us because initiatives like the JTI make it possible for regulators to require social media companies and search engines to promote those news organizations which comply with the European standard and relegate those that do not. The JTI has been incorporated into the EU's new Code of Practice on Disinformation, part of the Digital Services Act. By implementing these new codes of conduct, platforms will be able to show that they are complying with the Digital Service Act's requirements to combat the systemic risks, as it puts it, they are inflicting on democratic societies. Platforms that fail to comply with this obligation could be fined up to 6% of their global annual turnover. But we also need eternal vigilance, which is why we need the third R, research. We need you to help us stay ahead of those who pretend something or someone that they're not, to stop them before they start poisoning the well of information. And that's where the Irish universities can come in, I believe. Because in the end, disinformation is less about liars than believers. Those who subscribe to the fake news don't want to know the truth. They simply want to believe in something. The result is an echo chamber that serves to widen division in society. And if we can't agree on a common set of facts, that undermines democracy. And the casualties are truth and trust. And to borrow a phrase, truth matters.
Okay, thank you so much for that, John. Falsehood flies, the truth limps after it. I think truer now, even now, than it was when Jonathan Swift said. Really interesting, and some issues I'd love to tease out with you. You're going to stay with us and join our panel. We're also joined, and I know Mark introduced him already. I'll just give a brief introduction again. Dr. Kirsty Park, a postdoctoral researcher at DCU Institute of Future Media, Democracy and Society. We've got Professor Declan Devan, Professor of Health Research Methodology at University of Galway. We're joined by Fumi Janadu, journalism PhD student and academic tutor at University of Limerick, and MEP Billy Kelleher. Kirsty, I might come to you first because you've compiled Digital News Report for Ireland. You look at the kind of disinformation we are seeing. Just give us a flavour of the kind of trends that you have found.
Sure. Well, a lot of the disinformation that circulates in Ireland, thankfully, doesn't make it too far into the mainstream in terms of conversations or media coverage or politicians engaging with it. In the very deep disinformation spaces, we do see a lot around Ukraine, and the Kremlin's talking points are influential there. There's still a lot of vaccine misinformation circulating in those spaces, sometimes tied up in larger conspiracy theories about the pandemic being planned. And sometimes we also see content from the US, which can have some anti-LGBT elements. And probably the most concerning to me is that there is a far-right nationalist segment that really tries to promote quite a racist attitude to who belongs in Ireland and who deserves to be called Irish. And there is a risk when it comes to things like concerns around cost of living or the housing crisis that this could be capitalized on by people trying to promote those views. So right now, a lot of the things I've talked about are mostly on a smaller scale. And we do also see from the Digital News Report a lot of trust in news in Ireland. But there is a risk of those ideas becoming mainstream. And I think that's something that we do need to be alert about and to help protect people against.
Okay, Fumi, to you, how about that? How can we help university students how can we protect them or to be able to spot those kind of trends that Kirsty is talking about, that kind of misinformation?
Yeah, I think education is very important, and I'm very delighted to actually be a part of a team that tutor undergraduate students. And we kind of talk about, there's a module that we have called Social Media and Society. And what we do there is kind of inform students about misinformation, disinformation, and kind of get them to understand that when they read something or when they see something online, especially, they're to fact check. And, you know, we provide them with fact checking tools, especially, you know, web tools that they can use to fact check what they're seeing, and for them to also be very self-conscious about what they're seeing and question their own biases as well, because that's very important in, you know, forming opinions and knowing what exactly it is that you're reading and shaping your opinions based on the information you're receiving.
How do they respond to that, Fumi? I mean, even things like checking your own biases. I mean, it's something that even the likes of myself and John, who've been in the media for a lot longer than your students, it's something we probably need to do and check ourselves every now and then. How do they respond to that?
I think the attitude mostly would be, at first, them coming to an awareness of the fact that, okay, this is a thing. You know, you talking about yourself, you've been in the industry, so you kind of understand when someone says to check your bias, you kind of get it. But it's very new to them. And I think it's good to introduce it to them this young, for them to actually realize early on that actually, maybe my opinion is being shaped by something that I didn't even realize, an unconscious bias, which we all have. So I think the reaction at first is always one of, oh, so I have a bias, you know, and them just coming to that awareness of the fact that, you know, they hold on to things that, you know, that they are not even aware of. You know, the subconscious is there, and they have all these ideologies around things shaped, of course, by the media, and them being conscious of that is, I think, the beginning.
Okay. Declan, both John and Kirsty referred to the pandemic and the kind of misinformation that was there during the pandemic. What are the most misleading kind of health claims that are out there? And again, how do we tackle that?
Yeah, and thanks, Shane, and thanks, John, for a great talk. Obviously, during the pandemic, some of the most viral health misinformation was associated with COVID-19 itself as a disease. But typically, health misinformation circulates around cancer and unproven cures related to cancer, and in the health space, and around vaccines, as Kirsty mentioned. And vaccines, I think, is an interesting one because it's quite complex, because we know from this good evidence that when you, for example, can convince somebody that the belief they've held may be mistaken from an evidence-based perspective, that doesn't necessarily translate to a change in behavior. And that behavior could, for example, be a continuance around vaccine resistance, for example. But in terms of the most viral health misinformations we have is around COVID and then around cancer and other unproven cures. And of course, we all have grown up with health misinformation, from our grandmother's medicine cupboard with the flat 7-Up to treat every ailment under the sun, or dock leaves for nettle stings, etc. So it's been around a long time, and some of it is quite harmless. But we know in some areas of healthcare, it has led to serious harm, including death.
Yeah, I'm happy to bring forward research that shows flat 7-Up definitely does work, Declan, but we'll argue about that.
You and half the country, Shane.
Yeah. But just to stay with you for a second, Declan, I imagine like misinformation exists across all sectors, but particularly in health. I mean, it's because health, we're literally talking about life and death sometimes. And I suppose we all are at risk of clinging on to anything that we feel will help us at a time when we're at our most vulnerable.
Yeah, I think that's you hit the nail on the head, Shane. I think it's that emotion aspect that often brings associated with health, and also for some people in terms of the seriousness of the health. For example, in the cancer space, we know that approximately 80% of young people diagnosed with cancer, the first port of call for evidence around treatments is searching online. And that creates huge challenges, because lots of the information they're exposed to is unreliable. And we know, we've looked at those people, young people, actually it increases their anxiety around potential treatments. And the sadness around some of the cancer misinformation, and we're working with the Irish Cancer Society in a project looking at this to try and mitigate it in some way. But the real sadness around some of this would be, for example, people with some of the people with cancers and some significant treatments, for example. We know that people have delayed contemporary treatment in favor of some complementary, perhaps, treatment. And unfortunately, in some cancers, we know that has decreased the survival of those individuals. So it can, cause substantial harm and heartache in the health community, in the community around health. And we all know people who are affected by various health conditions.
Okay, that is a frightening prospect. Declan, we'll come back to you a little bit to I suppose, to try and tease out how you go about helping your students to I suppose change their thinking processes and particularly in the area of health. Billy Keller, if I could bring you in here. Disinformation, misinformation, how dangerous is that for society? How dangerous is it for politics, do you think?
Well, it's exceptionally dangerous because, I mean, there's so many platforms out there now. There's so many media forums whereby disinformation, misinformation can be spread. And of course, we now have a lot of evidence that, state actors like countries themselves, criminal organizations and others are very much involved in this. And it is becoming almost mainstream in terms of the discourse in politics around the issue of misinformation, disinformation. I'll give you a simple example. In 2021, Russia launched a campaign of disinformation about vaccines in Europe. They were trying to promote their Sputnik vaccine themselves, but across all the eastern flank of the European Union, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, elsewhere, there was huge disinformation and some misinformation as well on the issue of vaccines. And it made it very difficult for a lot of those countries in promoting the uptake of vaccines. And this was done because you still have strong elements of Russian-speaking people in those countries, but it was done very targeted, very methodically to undermine the European Union in terms of a vaccine rollout, and then to try and spread disinformation around our vaccines in Europe to promote Russian vaccines. And that was done at the behest of a country itself and some large companies that had some financial gain to be made in terms of promoting the Sputnik vaccine. So that's just one simple example. there's been a report carried out by the European Parliament whereby they reckon that over 300 million euros has been spent by Russia in interfering or funding political parties in Europe and the United States to try and undermine Western democracies. So they're spending lots of money directly to parties, but now you can see a lot of evidence coming through that they are now interfering through the cyber digital space in undermining the integrity of elections themselves, spreading disinformation in a very thematic, planned way to undermine elections. And you only saw the person that's in charge of Wagner, the Russian paramilitary mercenary organization, where he said quite openly that their role is to try and undermine Western democracies, and they now look at elections and the interference of elections as a prime way of doing that.
Okay, just briefly, because I do want to bring in the rest of the panel as well. How do we tackle that? How do we address that?
Well, I mean, obviously, the first thing in terms of political parties, there certainly must be greater obligations on political parties to show where their funding comes from. I mean, we can't have a situation where money is being sent into the European Union from outside to undermine democracy in itself. We saw it very evidently where there was some evidence of interference even in the UK around the whole Brexit debate. But that is a historical part of it. But it's still a fact that political parties are taking money from outside the European Union, and there's no obligation to declare in some countries. That has to be tightened up. I think it's a very important area that we just have to accept as well. Platforms have a role, and I don't want to diminish free speech, but there has to be some role in ensuring that at least it's verification of where the information is coming from, and particularly as you get near election times, where there has to be greater scrutiny. And there's another area I think it's going to be very difficult, but we're going to have to do it, and that is to ensure that we have independent, high quality investigative journalism. It's a very expensive format. You're in the business as well, Shane, John referred to as well. But I mean, we have to ensure that there's high quality investigative journalism so that they can spend time and they can do the research and investigate to ensure at least that some elements of this misinformation, disinformation is held to account in some way.
Yeah, okay. By the way, I should have mentioned, thanks to everybody who submitted questions when you were registering. But you can use the Q&A or the chat function at the bottom of the screen if you do want to add additional questions. We'll try and get to some of them. John, do you want to come in here on, I suppose, it's some of the points Billy was making there, and the
Sure.
potential damage to politics, and I suppose as Billy was addressing there, how we go about tackling that.
Well, I would agree with Billy about the importance of investigative journalism, and that's where Ireland's defamation laws and the proposed reforms are also important, because the awards being decided by juries acts as a chiller, really, and so many, it's a lottery. So you might as well go to the casino, because with the greatest respect, juries are perfectly able to decide whether something is right or wrong, or someone is guilty or not. But actually, Ireland is the only country where juries decide the weight and the amount of money potentially that is paid in compensation. And so, I welcome the fact that in the programme for governance, there's recommendations to change that, and the coalition government came forward with those plans earlier this year. There's no doubt that bad state actors want to undermine Western democracy. Whether you're China and Xi Jinping talking about his type of democracy and Western type of democracy, and the way to undermine that is to sow doubt about the integrity of processes, but also to try and put bad faith actors into the political system to undermine it from within. And we've seen that both from China and from Russia. Right now, let's not forget, the people of Russia have no idea quite how badly the campaign in the Ukraine is going, because Russian television simply is only able to report essentially the press release that comes from the Russian Ministry of Defense.
Can I ask you as well about your 3 R's, which I liked, particularly your final one, the rigorous fact-based research, which I think anyone who believes in journalism will wholeheartedly agree with. I'm curious though, in an area of social media, when you have stories breaking on social media, and there's a pressure on journalists to respond to that, how big a challenge is that for mainstream media, do you think?
Well, it is a challenge, but the most important thing is, that something is right, not first. And we're between friends, so I will let you. People in the UK at the BBC used to call Sky, when it first launched, never wrong for long, because they would go on air and they would break something and then they would correct it. Well, ultimately, that begins to undermine faith in journalism and faith in what you hear. If everything that you are all the time announcing has to be corrected, that's not great. And so, particularly for mainstream news, actually checking and double checking. I'm sure the same is true at News Talk, but RT has a policy that everything has to be double sourced. And if it's not, as managing director of news, I had to take a view as to whether the source was good enough. That is the right thing to do, and it doesn't matter if you're second and right. Better to be second and right than first and wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Can I bring you back in, Kirsty? We've had a little bit of reference to social media platforms. In your view, are the codes of practice strong enough for these social media platforms in this kind of area, and what needs to be done?
Sure. So, I mean, the EU brought in the Code of Practice on Disinformation in 2018, and this was a sort of voluntary code that the platforms could sign up to. So a lot of platforms did, and major ones like Meta or Twitter or Google. And we actually did some research into monitoring how the platforms applied the Code of Practice. And what we found is that platforms often talk the talk, but when you actually look at the quality of what they claim to be doing, it can be very poor. And so something that we've called for is much higher standards. And there is some progress there. So there's just been a strengthened code of practice, and there's also a Digital Services Act coming in. But I think ultimately we're still sort of relying on the platforms to do the right thing, which often just isn't enough, as we've seen again and again. And so I think there is a need to really call platforms to account, to have better accessibility to data for researchers, so we can actually understand what is the nature of what's going on and what things are they perhaps keeping from us, and also so that we can properly check that when they claim to be making actions, that they really are.
Okay, John, does it frustrate you as a traditional journalist that the new media isn't held to the same standards as maybe we in the more traditional media are?
Well, I think one of the really interesting things that came out of the digital news report was the first lesson you learn as a journalist is that you underestimate the audience at your peril. And the audience are perfectly capable of, the trust that they place in social media and the trust that they place in legacy media, traditional news sources. There is a growing gap in terms of the more traditional media and the less they trust social media. Forgive me. So I think the audience are alive to this, but there will always be a risk that particularly some cohorts who don't actually get news from traditional news sources. So we know that 18 to 25s, for example, disproportionately get their news from social media. And that is a concern because part of the correcting in your head is the questioning that begins when you see one story reported somewhere saying one thing, and in another place it's reported completely differently. Well, if you're only getting your news from one source, then that's a problem, because you won't be open to that course correction.
Fumi, you were nodding your head in agreement there.
Yeah, I just thought it was really interesting because I had a conversation with some students yesterday as well, and we're talking about how, especially amongst young people, I asked if any of them were subscribed or had bought a newspaper in a long time, and they said no. And I asked where they got their news from, and a lot of them said, they would get it from online and social media. And it was also a conversation we had about how TikTok, for example, is now a most reliable source of information for young people. And we have people out there being therapists and telling young people what their traumas are and what they're going through without actually being certified, you know? And these are the issues around, you know, online news and social media.
Yeah, John,
Jane,
you want to,
I just had one thing. You know, there's a danger here that we're a bit like King Canute, you know, trying to stop the social media waves crashing against the shore. The trick, I think, is to make sure that wherever people are finding it, whether it's on TikTok or whether it's on Instagram, they are getting it from sources that are verified and accurate. And that's where, coming back to something like the Journalism Trust Initiative comes in. You know, if you know that actually there is an endorsement, it doesn't matter whether you're listening to it or reading it on the RTE website or actually getting it from Instagram. You know, for RTE, we're not good. I say we because I still think of myself in that place. RTE is not going to get 18 to 25s downloading the app and getting their news from the RTE News app. They will get people on Instagram, and so for RTE, the biggest audience on Instagram is women aged 25 to 34. Well, that's a group of people that probably wouldn't come to RTE otherwise. So, you know, we need to be platform agnostic in terms of the making sure the good news you know, triumphs against the bad.
Fumi, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it's really true. But I think the fact that the traditional media especially is being discredited, and the way that, you know, traditional media, for example, the way that the news is being relayed by them, you would see young people listen to things like, you know, video essays and listen to people who sound like them. Now, these people wouldn't necessarily be professionals. They probably wouldn't even have an idea what they're talking about themselves. You know, like anybody, like we talk about citizen journalism, anybody's a journalist these days, you know, not particularly, but anybody can pick up, you know, a piece of information and say, you know, they're the ones and they're credible. Now, it's a question of how to actually get these young people especially to kind of understand that this is the way to verify what you're hearing, and this is who to believe. You know, at the end of the day, you know, we cannot stop them from getting the information from Twitter and from Instagram, but it's to actually, you know, like John said, is to be sure that whatever platform they're going to, they're getting, you know, the truth.
Okay, Declan, you wanted to come in there. I'll come to you in a second, Kirsty.
Yeah, and I think it's important that the conversation, you know, demonstrates this. It's not easy. There's multiple different sources of evidence, and there isn't an easy fix. If there was, I think we'd have implemented that a long time ago. I think misinformation and fake news will exist as long as humans do, and I think there is that technological solutions that need to be brought to bear, as Billy and others mentioned. They absolutely need to be there, and there's evidence that say they can work, but they won't work alone. I think unless we equip people with critical thinking skills around information, for example, health information, and meet them in their platforms, for example, in TikTok. But I think when we talk about trusted sources, how do people identify what a trusted source is and what is reliable information from that trusted source? So I think we've got to start looking at that critical thinking skills that we all need to be able to identify when a source of information is reliable and when that information...
How do you do that? How do you do that, Declan, with your students, for example? How do you go about doing that?
I think it's really challenging. And I think maybe looking back in it in years to come, the value we give to and the place that critical thinking has within our education curriculum across the globe will be a marker of success or not. I think to target misinformation, we need substantial improvements in our education systems at all levels, and including primary school. And that's one of our target areas, is we're working with primary school children to look at, can we develop critical thinking in primary school children about treatment claims in healthcare? And we've demonstrated that you can. You can get 8 to 10-year-olds to identify misinformation around health, critically assess that misinformation, and take a decision based on that assessment. And that's things like the START program that we run. But I think it's about introducing that critical thinking about information. And that information could be health information, political information, and through whatever channels. But I agree with John, we've got to go to their platforms. We've got to provide this critical thinking skills on their platforms.
John?
I don't want to do false flattery, but if that is the case, and I agree, I think critical thinking is essential, then actually I think Ireland is way better placed than many other countries, because the quality of, the curiosity of the Irish people, for a start, and the intellectual level of the Irish people, because of their love of literature, is significantly higher than many other countries. And so, there is hope in all of this. And, I think it lies in the innate good sense of the Irish people.
Kirsty, I know you wanted to come in there. I'm kind of curious, because I have a son in third level, and to me, his workload would be he's under a lot more pressure work-wise, workload-wise, than I would have been when going back to the late 80s and early 90s in college. Is there a danger do they have the luxury of taking the time to critically analyze, to assess? I mean, am I being overly concerned there in relation to that?
I mean, I think it doesn't necessarily have to be something that takes a lot of time. So, for instance, some of the work that we do looks at what is effective. And some of the interventions that are effective are things like inoculation, which basically is the idea that if you sort of show people the strategies or ideas that are used, or with pre-bunking, perhaps even show them some claims that they might encounter, it makes them more resilient when they come across that information. And I think that's kind of part of what we need to be doing, and also incorporating into curriculum, so that we're basically training people to, when they see a piece of content, to be able to recognize, am I being manipulated? Is this trying to take something out of context? And those are things that we probably all do to a certain extent, but that we have the ability to become more skilled at.
Okay, pre-bunking. I've learned a new word today. I hadn't heard that before. Interesting. Billy, you've been sitting there very patiently. What's your take on all of this?
Well, what's interesting is there was a report carried out by the Commission some time ago, and they published guidelines on foot of that research for teachers and educators. About 1/3 of under 15-year-old years of age are still poor in digital literacy skills. In other words, they're not great at maneuvering through the digital world out there in terms of checking out whether it's biased information, whether it's subjective information, the veracity of that information is an area that we have to do an awful lot of work in. So, I mean, we are aware of it. The European Commission has published guidelines. And what we need to do now is to ensure that there is a strong rollout of digital literacy skills to the younger generation. So instead of just putting in the keywords and taking whatever comes up in front of you as at face value, that there's that innate instinct to dig deeper to find out whether it is subjective, whether it is biased, whether it's misinformation or disinformation. And that is a key area where the Commission are now recognizing we are failing in our allowing our young students to be more equipped to deal with what's out there on the various platforms. And of course, they need to interrogate the information that's there. There's a lot of algorithmic based advertising and targeting of certain cohorts of population. So they need to be aware of it, and they need to know how to go about finding out the factual information rather than the fluff, misinformation, and more importantly, disinformation.
Okay, and Billy, just to go back to another of John's Orr's, regulation. I mean, are you as politicians, are you doing enough in that regard, or is there more that can be done, do you think?
Well, I mean, the Digital Services Act is out. We did publish guidelines, the European Union did publish guidelines a number of years ago. I think there's still an acknowledgement that there's a lot of work to be done. Of course, John did refer to the whole issue of defamation and all of that, and the different legal systems across the European Union. It is very, very difficult for the Union as a whole to put in place one size fits all, when you have so many different legal systems and different interpretations as to what is factual, what is truthful, what is offensive, and what is damaging. And that certainly is an area that causes the European Union great concern. But I think there's an acknowledgement that we have to do an awful lot more. And the reason we're looking at that from doing an awful lot more is, an awful lot of state actors are trying to undermine the basic Western values that we all hold dearly. And of course, one of the great basic values is the freedom of speech. So it is to get the balance right as to what is freedom of speech and how you regulate to ensure that we don't have disinformation that is targeted out there with the intention of undermining an individual or undermining a country or a democratic system, or just spreading falsehoods like we had in the area of COVID, for example.
Okay, and just briefly on John's point about libel laws, particularly in Ireland, Billy, they are incredibly stringent here.
They are, and there's no doubt. I mean, they are also, the threat is also being used even in political discourse now, where we talk about slaps, threats to people because they may have said something that's challenging a political party or an individual, whatever the case may be. I'm not pointing fingers at any party, but just in general.
Are you not?
In general, I'm not. No, I'm just saying in general, we have that chill factor to a certain extent. Of course, if you go across the Atlantic Ocean and you see the other side of the equation, where they literally can say anything about anybody at any stage, and it seems to be a free for all. Yeah. I just think that what we need to do is to have the ability to find right from wrong and defamation and libel, but that certainly the issue around high court proceedings, the fact that it's very expensive, damage is being awarded, massive damage is being awarded, puts a huge chill factor on basic discourse. Because let's be honest, one of the biggest fears very often for politicians, from journalists and many or more, is the solicitor's letter.
Yeah.
John, it's just worth saying that one of the things that the government took out of the proposed changes to the defamation laws was a threshold that it had to be, you had to do serious harm to somebody's reputation in order to actually be able to bring a case. The government took out that threshold, and I think that actually would be very helpful. And it's disappointing that that isn't in Helen McEntee's proposed bill. Hopefully, it may come back at a later stage, but I think that would be a significant measure to actually making sure that actually freedom of speech is protected. But people also still have the right to go and protect their good name when somebody has seriously abused it.
Yes,
I think.
Sorry, who wanted to come in there? Was it?
Sorry, Shane.
Declan. Yeah, Declan. Sorry, go ahead.
Just picking up on Billy's point, I think hearing about these interventions, that digital literacy, that critical thinking about information, be it health, to whatever portal, be it digital or be it print media, whatever it might be, that critical thinking. If we think that's important, it would be a plea, I think, that whatever we do, we evaluate rigorously, so that we're rolling out evidence-based interventions that we know will make an impact. And I think there's lots of opportunities for us at all our levels, as I mentioned, primary, secondary, third level, and the broad public indeed. And why is it important? Because, for example, in the area of health, I think somebody's comment I see in the chat, Paula Byrne, it's a really important point to make. In health, there can often be uncertainty about what the best course of action might be. And how you engage the public about communicating uncertainty is extraordinarily challenging, because people want black and white answers, yes or no. And it's only by sitting down and teasing out the issues underpinning an evidence base that often is changing daily, let alone weekly or fortnightly. So the evidence under forming decisions that might be taken needs to be looked at. How do you keep up to date with a large volume of evidence that might help you take a choice that might be better for you or your loved one? So again, I think whatever we do, let's evaluate it really robustly so that we can know what actually does make a difference.
Okay, Fumi and Kirsty, I'm kind of interested as well in this. We've touched on this rise of citizen journalism. How can we have the rise of citizen journalism and at the same time ensure that social media is used more responsibly? Is that wishful thinking? Is that possible? Kirsty, do you want to have a go at that?
Sure. I mean, I think for me, it's and it was mentioned in one of the comments there, like there's a danger too in kind of separating this out into kind of social media and journalism. I think people are living their lives and communicating online. And a point that I actually wanted to make earlier around the digital news report is a trend we see in that 18 to 25-year-old bracket over the last number of years is that they're becoming less interested in news and that they're avoiding news more. And that's a big issue, if we think that that's that younger age group disconnecting in some way. And I think a big thing that we all need to kind of think about and try and answer is, if we're sort of surprised that young people are getting their news from TikTok, for example, it's sort of finding out, well, why is that? What is it they're looking for? What are we not meeting their needs about what they're interested in traditional news? Are there things around wanting to hear from voices that are similar to them or similar to their age group? So those are the kind of questions I think we need to ask. And when it comes to that, participatory media can be fantastic for the sharing of ideas. I don't think we need to see it as a bad thing necessarily, but I think we need to, I suppose, make greater efforts to understand what young people are getting out of that and how we can integrate quality sources into that along with that sort of media literacy approach.
Okay, Fumi.
There was a, sorry.
Yeah, I'll bring in Fumi, and then John, I'll ask you to come in if that's okay.
All right. Yeah, I think what Kirsty, she's kind of just hit the nail on the head. I think that we cannot say that, citizen journalism or participatory journalism should be discarded. They do have the, usefulness, and they're very important. And I think with quality education and, with the little that we're doing in the universities, for example, and with Declan saying, even taking it to primary and secondary schools, it's important that when people are properly educated, they're more conscious of the information that they're passing across. I remember we having a conversation as well about how if students were aware of the fact that they have been people to peddle disinformation, or they've been ones to spread rumors. And we kind of had that conversation, and it kind of got them thinking about, the kind of information that they're passing across and how they're approaching spreading information and, spreading news or being the ones saying something about something. So I think the education bit is very important, and the more we do it, the better it gets.
John, you wanted to come in.
Sure, I was just going to, it's very easy for us to all despair here, I think. But so I want to just keep coming back with some more good news. Pew, the US research organization, did a massive study of young people and what they expect from the news. And the reassuring thing is they expect the same as the rest of us. They expect it to be factual. They expect it to be truthful. They expect it to engage them. So again, there's a risk in all of this, I think, that I completely agree that the way that we present it needs to be different. But the bottom line is everybody expects the same thing from fact-based journalism, whether you are 18 or 80.
Declan, education is key here, isn't it?
It is, and I guess the challenge is deciding what format that type of education might take. I do agree with John. I think we've got a lot of the building blocks and foundations in Ireland for actually taking a lead role or contributing to that broader global contribution to thinking about, for example, health misinformation. I take Mark's point in the introductions earlier on about the universities for a public good and what role we can have as universities in contributing to that. Media literacy, for example, John and others talking about, do we offer nationally programs for journalists around accessing and interpreting and health information, for example, because there's a lot of concepts that need to be understood within that rapidly changing environment to be able to communicate that. So I am full of optimism, I think. I think it is within the education sector across the different levels of education has a major role to play in this. And I am optimistic, but I think we've got to, maybe put some actions behind some of the rhetoric around the need for these education programs and actually start doing something about it. For example, our primary school curriculums talks about critical thinking around health. Do we have any national evidence-based programs in primary schools, in secondary schools, in third level? I'm not so sure.
Okay, all right. Let's say we have about 7 minutes or so. I promise everybody I will have you all out by 2 o'clock so you can all get back to work. Let's just have a look at some of the questions coming through on our Q&A. Niamh Kirk has a question for you, Fumi. What can we do to enhance the training at university level? How can we link journalism students, postgrads, researchers with newsrooms? Or what can news organizations do to facilitate this, given the expertise and resources are already there in universities? Interesting question.
Yeah, it is a very interesting question. And I think that, for example, I think in UL, we're also starting a media literacy module as well. And this would be for professionals mostly. And so we kind of, taking it a bit, out of just the young people within the university and kind of doing one of our professional courses as well. But I also think that one thing that we could do is, I think what we're already doing is to create the consciousness. And beyond creating the consciousness, I think that it is important to incorporate it in every, even beyond journalism students, because what we've noticed is sometimes journalism students don't end up being journalists. And we have people, you can just start up a blog today and you have, all this following, or you start a TikTok or or a YouTube channel or a vlog, and you become the source of information for certain people, just because, you know, that's something that you're interested in. So we shouldn't limit the education to just journalism students. I think not even just the arts, we should kind of take it across board. So I feel like every department within the university should actually have students taking part in media literacy modules to kind of make everybody aware. Because at the end of the day, I've seen on Instagram where we have doctors who are now, you know, social media influencers, and people believe them whenever they say, you know, it's bad to drink water. So, you know, things like that, for example, it's important that everybody is educated, and that way we're able to, you know, kind of work with that.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant point.
I think
Declan, you want to come in there?
Sorry, Shane. I think go back. There's a really good point about everybody. I think that's the importance maybe of targeting primary school children, also the younger age groups, because those children will be the future doctors, journalists, researchers, influencers, etc. I think we've got to start looking at starting this much earlier.
Yeah, Billy, I was going to ask you a question, and actually a question just popped up there on my screen. I can't locate it now, but asking about the kind of sledging, I think is the term used by the person asking the question, you know, right wing, left wing, the kind of terms that are used. Like, there is a responsibility among politicians as well. I would venture to suggest that the higher the level of tribalism in politics, the more disinformation you're probably going to get.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, it's probably the chicken and egg situation to a certain extent.
Yeah,
I mean,
true.
politicians, you know, politicians sort of follow the crowd as much as lead the crowd, being truthful in modern democracies, unfortunately, where, you know, strong leadership sometimes is just not there. Yes, I mean, the difficulty is that, you know, you have a polarization of politics across the Western world. So you have left wing, right wing. The centre is being torn apart in many cases. And a lot of it is as a result of you know, populist politicians on the left or the right, then the disinformation, the misinformation. You take, for example, the issue of migration, Shane. I mean, that issue is really being used very much now across Europe, primarily from the right wing, in terms of just using that in such an emotive way, where fact never even enters into the debate or the discourse. It is just primarily disinformation and malicious misinformation, if there's such a thing, whereby it's just thrown out there. And there's so much of it put out there that politicians don't even have the capacity to respond to it. Those that want to have a calm, rational debate can't even get ground, because politicians have responsibility, but so do journalists, to ensure that there's proper interrogation and that it isn't just soundbite reporting of issues. In other words, that there's proper debate and substance on programs where politicians are given time to explain, and also that there's an interrogation process of politicians, as opposed to just, you know, these sound bites that really are causing huge difficulties. And just reference there just to citizens journalism. I mean, citizens journalism, it benefits, but it also can do huge damage. And we see it particularly on the right, you know, people standing outside reception centres for asylum seekers, outside migrant hostels, you know, just explaining to the world what is happening with no relevance to fact. You know, no fact checking it whatsoever, just using these things in an emotive way. So citizens journalism can be very, very negative. It is if it is abused for very emotive reasons. And as I say, I'm not targeting the right specifically, but on this issue on migration, it is primarily the right are using it.
John, it just did. Anne got back in the question she asked. She was asking, "Is it ethical to use such terms to stop debate?" And Billy was suggesting maybe that we in the media fall into the trap a little bit of sort of simplistic analysis and putting people into boxes.
I'm not sure that's the case. I do think there's a herd mentality, and so one of the things that I reflect on my 5 years in Ireland is it's quite difficult to change the direction of travel once a story starts running, for example. And because it's a small place, stories take on, given I am now freed of my discretion. I used to come home to London most weekends, because I used to say that reading the Sunday Independent in London was a lot easier than reading it in Dublin, because it didn't seem to matter nearly as much. In a place like Ireland, stories take on a life of their own. and it's then very difficult, whether they are right or wrong, actually, to stop them, because somebody starts commenting on what somebody else has said, and there's it's a bit like a snowball. It tumbles away. So I do think a little more thought, actually, about what is served by doing a particular story or continuing to gnaw at a particular bone would do us all good.
Okay.
But John, just on Brexit there, for example, I mean, there was
Just
no
briefly,
interrogation.
Billy, if you can.
Yeah, like there was no interrogation by the BBCs of this world and the mainstream medias in the UK around the Brexit issue. That's what I'm referring to in terms of journalism. But there was proper integrity and scrutiny of it. You know?
Okay.
Yes, I completely agree, and certainly no scrutiny when conservative politicians start talking about the president signing a trade deal with the United States and the UK. It's not the president's gift, but there was little scrutiny of that.
Okay, we are out of time. I just want to get a very brief final word from all of our panelists, just on, I suppose, one message you'd like people to take away today. Kirsty, can I start with you first, please?
Sure, I'd say each of us can start with educating ourselves or looking at resources to educate others. And I'd actually suggest the hub that we run in DCU, edmohub.ie, has a list of resources that you can use there as part of that.
Okay, brilliant. Declan?
Yeah, I think it's think about how we can introduce critical thinking for ourselves and for all sectors within our population to inoculate ourselves against misinformation.
Okay, Billy?
Yeah, well, freedom of speech is one of the great attributes of Western democracies and our values. And, it is also one of our weaknesses in the sense that others will use that to undermine us. So we must be vigilant.
Fumi?
I think we all need to just take responsibility for what we hear and what we share, and to be conscious of the fact that we are, probably causing some harm if we're spreading the wrong information.
John?
Fact-based journalism was the antidote to the infodemic during COVID. It can guide the way. And, I think there are reasons for hope. And in that, I think Ireland is well-placed and better placed than many other countries to navigate this successfully.
Mark, do you want to say a very final quick word? If you don't, that's okay.
Just to say thanks very much. I think this has been really informative, and I really do think that there are things the universities need to be thinking about doing in terms of supporting knowledge and understanding of the way in which one has to do this kind of thing of fact checking, making sure that the stories are real.
Okay. All right. Thanks indeed, Mark. Thanks to John. Thanks to Kirsty, Declan, Fumi, and Billy Kelleher as well. Really, really stimulating. Oh, somebody's asking the name of that hub again, Kirsty. Do you want to just remind listeners of the hub? You've put it up. You've put it up on it.
Yeah, edmohub.ie.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that. A really, really interesting debate. We could easily go on for another hour or two, but we better let people get back to work. Just to remind you all, the Future of Ireland event series will continue in 2023. So keep an eye on iua.ie for more details. That's our lot for today. Really enjoyed your company. Hope you enjoyed the discussion. Take care and have a good afternoon.